Happy birthday, Retrospectors. This show is 5 years old.
And we're an independent show that relies on your support to keep going.
So help us fund future episodes and get exclusive content at patreon.com/retrospectors.
That's patreon.com/retrospectors.
Content warning. Check the show notes for more information. It's May 22nd, 1958, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
When Jerry Lee Lewis touched down at Heathrow Airport for his first UK tour, Today in History, in 1958, he was greeted by a gaggle of journalists all wanting to get a quote from the hottest new thing in rock and roll. But it was one seemingly innocuous query that brought the whole thing to a screeching halt when reporter Ray Berry noticed a wide-eyed adolescent girl among Lewis's entourage and asked the fateful question, "Who are you?"
And the answer to that question was she was Myra Gale Brown, and she was Jerry Lee Lewis's wife. And now, look, he'd been warned ahead of his British tour that he shouldn't take his new wife to the UK, but he didn't listen because he couldn't see any particular problem with bringing her on the road with him.
And he had no familiarity with the British tabloid press.
Right, yeah. But he just saw things incredibly simply. In the eyes of others, however, there were several issues. First of all, Myra Gale Brown had been just 13 years old when they got married on December the 12th, 1957. Second, she was his cousin once removed, the daughter of his bassist and cousin, J.W. Brown. Third, she was also his third wife, and their marriage had taken place just before Lewis's second divorce had been finalised. So actually, it was a bigamous marriage. And that second marriage had taken place before the previous one had been terminated. So there were a few things going on here.
Yeah, two bigamies cancel each other out, don't you know?
Right.
You know, I'm pleased in a way that this is the second time that Jerry Lee Lewis has come up on this series, because we have done an episode about the $1 Million Quartet, and in that paid tribute to his musical genius and his compelling performances and his skills on the piano. So it's nice, it's liberating to now clear an episode to talk about how he was a massive piece of
Right.
abused and possibly killed some of his wives. He had 7 in total throughout his life. Many of them divorced him using abuse, physical and mental abuse, as the reason for those divorces. This is a man who had the nickname The Killer. I mean, it was all out there in the open. Like, people described him as The Killer affectionately, which was a moniker he was given at school after he attempted to strangle one of his teachers using the teacher's own tie. So he was known to be, I suppose if you were being kind, a problematic hillbilly, right? And then when you take him out of the southern states and land him at Heathrow Airport in front of the European press, specifically the Daily Mail, and they say, "Oh, she's your wife, okay. How old did you say she is again?" It's not going to go well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when they asked how old is she, they originally said 15. This was the story that Lewis and his management initially stuck to. You know, he would later say that he was totally astonished by this reaction from the English press, but obviously he knew not to say that she was 13, so he knew there was something about it that wasn't going to go over well. Myra and Lewis had married in Mississippi, where the minimum age for marriage at the time was 12. So it's understandable that Myra herself didn't realise that saying she was a 15-year-old bride was hardly less shocking than a 13-year-old one in the UK. And she was a baby. When they got married, she was too frightened to tell her parents, so she left their marriage certificate on the table before she went to school the next morning. When Elvis met her at the Sun Records studios shortly after the marriage, he asked her if she was Jerry's baby sister.
Although, to be fair, Elvis was with Priscilla at the time, who was also 15.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, well, 15-year-old is one thing, 13-year-old, come on, man. But either way, it was an immediate press sensation, not least because they had a photo of Myra, and her youth is strikingly clear. One newspaper described her as looking like a well-scrubbed fourth former.
And then what happened is that the details of the scandal kind of teased out on consecutive days in the British press, because the first bombshell was he's landed with this 15-year-old wife. Then the next day it was like, no, she's actually 13. Then the next day was, and she's his cousin. And then it was, and it's a bigamous relationship. And then it was, and it's his second bigamous relationship.
Yeah.
So by the end of this week of coverage, it was untenable for Jerry Lee Lewis and his new wife to remain in the UK at all. And let's just underline what a massive change in circumstances that was in such a short time frame. Because, as you said at the beginning, Rebecca, He was a huge star. He was massively popular in the UK because Whole Lot of Shaking Going On and Great Balls of Fire had both been massive hits. And this was the first major rock and roll star to make the journey across the Atlantic in lieu of Elvis, let's be honest. Elvis had been drafted into the military. This was the moment that he could have basically become Elvis. And demand had been so high that they booked 27 appearances for him across the UK. He was staying in the Mayfair Hotel. This was, this was like Michael Jackson coming over in the 1980s. And he blew it instantly the moment he touched down.
Yeah, when it was revealed that she was actually 13, that was the moment the response went from yikes to what the actual several newspapers actually called for him to be deported. They said he was a menace, to the UK's teenagers. And the venues that he had booked were half empty, and those who did turn up booed him. They shouted jeers like cradle robber. And, he left in high dudgeon. He gave a very temperamental press conference at Heathrow Airport before he left. He really didn't feel like he had done anything wrong, wildly. The problem was that so much was now coming out, and that continued when he got back to the US. The US press were all over this as well. And the record label, which in this era obviously had a lot of control over artists' images, had worked extremely hard to play down his wild lifestyle, of which more later. But once Myra's identity was out of the box, the press were just going to town, and there was so much, not least the fact that Jerry Lee Lewis was 22 and on his third marriage of 7, and before becoming the husband of a child bride, he had actually been a child groom. His first marriage in 1952, he was 16. He married a girl of the same age.
She was 16.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just at least they were the same age. And just before his 18th birthday, he married his second wife, as you mentioned, a few weeks before his divorce from Barton went through. An understandable mistake for a teenager to make, making it bigamous. But apparently this was for a good reason. He had actually got his second wife, Jane Mitchum, pregnant, and apparently her brothers had turned up at his house with horsewhips to encourage him to do the right thing.
Yeah, well, this really was one of the first big scandals of rock and roll. And at the time, religious leaders, particularly in the US, obviously hated rock and roll and called it the devil's music. And the radio stations that didn't play it also hated it and tended to rail against it. It tended to be regarded as crude and rude and threatening to older generations who worried about what it would do to their teenagers. And I think that's what this represented. Jerry Lee Lewis marrying Myra was the proof that their fears were legitimate. And I think that's what led to this broad kind of media attack. It took him years, decades even, to rebuild his career. Lewis really didn't have his commercial stride again until he became a country artist in 1968.
But the marriage actually lasted 12 years in the end. She gave birth to their first child the next year when she was 14, and a few years later a daughter. She said that all she wanted was a quiet domestic life, which was not what she got. You can tell that just from Lewis's performances. He was this inhibition-free, rampaging id. It was hard drinking, drug-fueled, very violent and temperamental. Once he showed up at Graceland in the middle of the night, off his face on pills, waving a pistol, trying to cool Elvis out. Another time he shot one of his backing band in the chest. Ultimately, she did find the kind of life she wanted, the quiet suburban life. She became a real estate agent. She married a guy called Richard Williams in 1984, and they've lived in a suburb of Atlanta ever since. And in interview, she's kind of phlegmatic about the whole affair. Despite everything she endured, she ultimately said she felt like Lewis was, quote, a good person, and she emphasized her own agency. I think she felt like the portrayal of her, including by Winona Ryder in the biopic Great Balls of Fire, as this naive little girl, was kind of a re-victimization of everything that she had gone through. She was unsupportive of child marriage, however, though. In 2014, she said, "If you say to me now there's a 13-year-old girl over here who wants to get married, I would say, God, please do not do that, little girl. Go to college, get an education, then figure it out." But it was a different world. Things have changed so drastically. Options, mindsets, this world has gone so fast the last 50 years, you can't keep up with it.
She said, "I was only 13, but people said I was more mature than Jerry." And I think that at least seems very clear. He was 22 when he married her, and a bit of a sort of child man in some ways. He does seem very immature and out of control. In no way does that defend any of his actions. But I think that, something about her defense throughout her life of what she did and what they did together, there is a sincerity to it, even if, as her life progressed, she was like, actually, I can see why that is now wrong. But at the time, I don't think she could, and I don't think he could.
Yeah, well, he had an opportunity to articulate that in 2012, and the way he put it was this to his biographer: "She was a woman. She looked like a grown woman, blossomed out and ready for plucking." And yet, he continued to be feted throughout his life. I mean, he did come back to Britain and was invited to perform in the UK many times. This incident completely forgotten. As late as October 2009, he opened the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 25th anniversary concert at Madison Square Garden. His last albums, he did a sort of Johnny Cash type thing where he did a sort of mature man of rock bit. And he had duets with Mick Jagger, Bruce Springsteen, Jimmy Page, Rod Stewart. Elton John was said to be shaking with nerves when he met him backstage about 10 years ago. And it's because, obviously, he was there at the beginning of rock and roll. He was that link, wasn't he? When others had died, there was no Chuck Berry anymore and there was no Elvis Presley, and he was still around. People just let that eclipse the very unsavoury details of his private life.
Yeah, and it would have been one thing if he had become a reformed character and led a more quiet private life, but that really wasn't happening as well. You know, after his divorce from Myra, his subsequent marriages were also incredibly messy. He was in the midst of divorcing his fourth wife, Jaron Pate, when she drowned in a swimming pool accident. I have to say he was not there at the time, just to clear his name. His fifth wife, Shawn Stevens, died of a methadone overdose 77 days into the marriage, and it has been suggested the death might not have been accidental. She was found bloody and bruised. His sixth marriage was the one that kind of stuck. He was married to Carrie McCarver for 21 years, and then he managed to fit in one more. He got married again, his seventh and final marriage, to Judith Brown in 2012, which lasted until his death in 2022. So
it's like Henry VIII, isn't it? Marriage, divorce, died, child bride, swimming pool, Great Balls of Fire.
And so another week of retrospecting ends. But next week begins a day early at Club Retrospectors. Join us now to get an exclusive episode every Sunday. Patreon.com/retrospectors.